Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Walker Art Center. My name is Sarah Peters. I direct public programs here in the Education Department, and I want to thank you all for coming on what appears to be our first day of winter in Minnesota. So you are the brave ones. Thank you. Tonight's lecture is the last program related to an exhibition that we currently have up called Brave New Worlds. If you haven't seen it, it's upstairs in galleries 4, 5, and 6, and it is well worth a visit. It is a show that makes an effort to contain in 3 smallish galleries a varied and vibrant view of the world through contemporary art practice. Drawing on artists from many disciplines and nationalities, this collection of pieces privileges us to see the world in a new way. The poetry, humor, and irony in these works come from a sincere and often courageous effort on the part of the artists to put contemporary life into image and form. These qualities are also found in the best of foreign reporters, those who travel the globe with the same spirit of curiosity. In conjunction with this exhibition, we wanted to hear from a veteran journalist whose daily work of questioning and synthesizing information also keeps us connected to the world in a different, although very crucial way. So we invited writer Janine di Giovanni to come to Minnesota, and lucky for us and for all of you, she agreed. Di Giovanni belongs to a generation of foreign correspondents who cut their teeth on the ground. They come from the pre-blog era, when newspapers sent them to all corners of the globe for weeks and months at a time, with the mandate to not come back without a story. The kind of reporting that results from this position is thoroughly researched, nuanced in its explanations of complex political situations, and compassionate. Starting with the first Palestinian Intifada in the late 80s and proceeding from there to Central America, Africa, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Middle East, and the Caribbean, Di Giovanni carried her notebooks through an over 18-year career of constant travel to volatile situations in nearly every conflict zone of the world. She has stories of being caught in aerial bombing raids, drinking coffee with reviled war criminals, and holding strangers as they died. These experiences are described with stunning clarity in her books Madness Visible, which is a memoir of the Balkan conflicts, Against the Stranger, which is about the effect of occupations during the First Intifada on both Palestinians and Israelis, and A Place at the End of the World, a collection of writings from 7 years of global reporting. Di Giovanni writes about the people in these places long after their plights have appeared above the fold. She approaches her work out of a responsibility to report on human rights violations as they go ignored by much of the mainstream press. These days, Di Giovanni travels on assignment less than she used to. From her home in Paris, she serves as a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, a writer for the Times of London and the New York Times Magazine, among many other publications, and is currently working on several larger projects, including a book on war photographers. Her work on the front lines of human rights advocacy continues through a campaign she works on to regulate small arms. Her last trip to the States involved a stop at the UN General Assembly for a speech on this issue. One of the ideas put forth by the curators in this exhibition upstairs is the position that making art is an act of bravery. In her essay from Neiman Reports that is reprinted in the Brave New Worlds catalog, Di Giovanni talks about bravery, explaining that she does not consider herself to be particularly brave. Courage is reserved for other people, she says. Well, as you listen to her stories tonight, I invite you to be the judge. Before I invite Janine to the stage, I also want to remind you that we are webcasting live this evening on the web. And so when we get to the Q&A session after her talk, please use the microphones that the ushers will have in the aisles to ask your questions so that they get recorded. And afterwards, Janine will be happy to sign books out in the lobby. Please welcome Janine di Giovanni.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here tonight in this wonderful city, and thanks so much for coming out on such a cold night. I'm going to start talking to you about Simon Wiesenthal, who died 2 years ago, aged 96, and spent half a century dedicating his life to chasing the Nazis. He was once asked what his goal was, and he replied very simply, saying that catching these men wasn't really an act of vengeance on his own part, because of course he had been in the camps and twice tried to kill himself. But he did it as an act of never forgetting. His work, he said, and I'll quote him, is so that these Nazi crimes are brought to light so that a new generation knows about them, so it will never happen again. A few years ago, I was sitting watching the news about the death of Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian leader. And I kept thinking about Wiesenthal, and I kept getting angrier and angrier, thinking that if we had paid attention to what he said, then we would have seen the first signs of nationalism emerging in the early 1990s in the former Yugoslavia. And if we had done that, thousands and thousands of lives would have been saved. Entire villages would not have been ethnically cleansed. Rape camps would not have destroyed the lives of hundreds of women. And families wouldn't have been ripped apart. So I wasn't thinking about him or his family, perhaps a bit selfishly, when I heard the news of his death. What I was thinking about was an incident from Sarajevo, from the siege in 1992. It was a freezing cold winter. I imagine it's probably the equivalent of Minneapolis, the cold in Sarajevo. There was no heating, there was no electricity, there was no water. The city was completely encircled in a kind of medieval siege, no plumbing, no food getting in except the occasional humanitarian aid. And I heard the news with some colleagues of mine that an old people's home on a front line had been completely abandoned by the staff. They had all run away because the shooting was so severe. So I made my way out to the front line with another colleague who is sadly now dead. He was killed in Sierra Leone. And the first thing we found was an old man who had been shot by a sniper between the eyes, trying to chop wood to keep the other people alive. And then we went inside, and I began to count the dead who had died in their beds from the cold, with no one to take care of them and no food, no heating. And as I was walking through this incredibly grim scene, suddenly an arm reached up from a pile of clothes, and it was an old woman, and she was still alive, barely. And she just said to me, "Zima, Zima, winter," which means winter in Serbo-Croat. And so this is one of the images I kept thinking about, and thinking about, this is one life of many that could have maybe been saved. The other image I can't get out of my head is a group of women who I met many years ago and met again quite recently. They're all mothers, sisters, and wives of some of the men who were killed in the massacre of Srebrenica. They're called the Mothers of Srebrenica, and their men, as some of you probably know, were murdered in 1995, July 1995. 8,000 men and boys were killed, were pushed into the forest, trapped like animals, shot, pushed into mass graves. Many of their bones are still not discovered. What's really horrible about Srebrenica is that we, all of us, the international community, did nothing to stop it. And Srebrenica was a United Nations protected area. It was a so-called safe haven. We, and I put myself into that category, all of us allowed a genocide to happen. We did nothing to protect or shelter these people who are our fellow man. And the worst part of this for me is that this was a European war. It was a backyard war. It was 3 hours by plane from London. And we knew it was happening, and we allowed it to, under the eyes of the United Nations. But the story I want to tell you tonight is a kind of repercussion of that. All of those survivors of the 8,000 men, the ones whose bones were never found, live with a kind of constant feeling that their men or their sons or their brothers are going to come home. And I can't really describe it other than that if the worst thing in the world happens to you, you still believe, you have some kind of hope. Well, maybe they're not dead. Maybe they're lost in the woods. Maybe they'll come home. But 2 summers ago, a videotape was unearthed, and it was found by the work of an incredibly brave Serbian human rights worker who heard about it. And what it was a group of paramilitaries called the Scorpions filmed themselves, and I have no idea why. I suppose as a kind of trophy or something like a snuff film. But they filmed themselves murdering a group of men, a group of Bosnian men. And they took this film very proudly, and then they hid it. And this human rights worker found out about it. She heard about it for years and years and years, and she tracked it, and she found the man who had it, and she got it. And she brought it to The Hague, the War Crimes Tribunal, and it was used as very important evidence. But the most important thing for me is that this film was shown on Bosnian television, really without a warning. And some of the men, there were 6 men shown killed in that video. Their families were watching it that night, and they didn't know. And so one minute they were watching the evening news, and the next thing they know, they saw their brother, their son, their husband being killed. So I went back to try to find, 5 of the families were still in Bosnia. I wanted to find them, and I wanted to see what had happened, what their feelings were, how they were living with this kind of unspeakable horror. And the first person I found was a beautiful 23-year-old woman called Sanada. Her father was murdered on the tape. She had been a little girl when her dad, when she last saw him, he was called Ismail, when he was marched into the woods. And her memories are that it was after lunch, and her dad had been a frontline soldier, but really he was a teacher. I mean, no one in the Bosnian army was a professional soldier because it was an army that was just created to defend the country after the war started. And she was angry at her father because he'd been on the front line for days and days and days, and he had come home, and she wanted to play with him, and then the sirens sounded in the town, which meant that the town was falling. And he hurried out, and she was angry, and he went to kiss her, and she kind of brushed him away. And she remembers that he was wearing a blue shirt and a jacket, a leather jacket. And she put her nose up against the window, and she was watching him, sort of saying, waving goodbye, Daddy. That was the last she saw him. 10 years later, she's watching television, and she saw the leather jacket, and she realized it was her father. And that's how she knew that he really was dead. Then I found a second survivor, and she was a woman called Nuria, and her son was 17 years old, and he was killed on the video. And she had another son who was killed in the war by a mortar attack, and her husband was shot in the head by a sniper in the doorway of their home. And she described all these things to me in the most brave and stoic way. And this is why I say that I'm not courageous. These are the people that are really courageous. But anyway, as I sat with her in her home, she lived out, none of these people ever went back to Srebrenica, by the way. They all live outside of it. She was talking to me with such dignity, and I just thought how much agony the human spirit could take before it cracked, and that this agony was inflicted by other human beings. It didn't have to happen. Her family didn't have to die. If there was no war, if there was no greed, if there was no nationalism on the part of politicians, she would still have her family. She told me about watching it on TV. She said she was just watching TV and suddenly this video came on and she saw the back of a boy and she didn't realize it was her son. And then she did, and she couldn't turn off the television set, she said, because it was, as she told me, my heart kept drawing me to it just to see my son, my little boy. That was a very painful interview to do. Then I went to see another mother who was called Kadira, and she and her daughter, Berezeta, whose husband was killed, were living in this incredibly depressing half-built house outside of Sarajevo. They had also seen the video by chance, and they had also seen their son and brother Sidik die on the video. And Berezeta had also lost her husband in Srebrenica. What really touched me was the way I kept thinking as I interviewed these people that it would be generations. You know, it would have to be 2 or 3 generations down the line before there could be any kind of reconciliation or healing. It's not that these people are full of hate, it's just that they're full of so much sorrow and pain. And one of the things that they said to me, which I hear quite a lot, is that the justice of The Hague, the War Crimes Tribunal, is not enough for the men that killed our children. Jail, they said, is too comfortable. So maybe you're wondering why I'm talking to you about a very distant war, the war in the Balkans, instead of Iraq or Afghanistan or Sudan. And the reason I am is I'm trying to make a point. War, for me, is not about guns and grenades and front lines. It's not about tanks and military plans and being embedded with the US Army. It's not about command centers or generals, really. That's part of it, as are the evil politicians that are usually behind it. But for me, it's really about people. It's about families, it's about society, it's about how it's ripped apart, it's about how people try to keep their lives together. It's about how they try to send children to school during war, how they stand in lines for hours just trying to get a liter of water, how they burn their poetry books to keep warm, how amputations occur without anesthetic in hospitals, how you walk for 50 miles in the snow with a kid on your back because you're escaping your village burning down, or giving birth in the woods with bombs exploding, your house being looted, your city being destroyed, your country being destroyed, and the worst thing, probably, and the thing I hear the most from people, is being totally helpless to stop it. There's nothing you can do. It's about losing your children, seeing your husband murdered, losing your identity, your pride, your home, your entire sense of being, and being powerless and robbed of any justice. I met all of those people I just described, and I've seen all of those situations over the past 18 years. And I've reported war and conflict, as Sarah said, in most violent conflicts that have taken place over the past 2 decades. I remember all of these people, and they're like ghosts to me. There's a little boy in Baghdad who lost both his arms when an American smart bomb wasn't smart enough and crashed into his house, killing his family and wounding him forever. There's a little Serbian boy blinded because he went out in a field during the NATO war in Kosovo to check on his cows and got hit by a mortar, or actually got hit by the shrapnel. There's a woman in Grozny I will never forget, who was a doctor, but who was standing just screaming at the top of her lungs, looking completely mad, and she was mad. She had been driven insane by the shelling. And the strangest thing, people just kept walking by her, and no one stopped to help her, it was as though that kind of madness was just what happens. And there's a 6-month-old baby I met in Freetown, Sierra Leone, whose arms were amputated here and here, just so that she would be a constant reminder to anyone that saw her of the power of the RUF rebel soldiers. I don't know if any of you saw Blood Diamond. I mean, I usually don't like Hollywood films, but I think there was a very good depiction of the fall of Freetown and the power of the RUF and the child soldiers. And just watching the news here tonight, I see that the UN has called Sierra Leone the worst place on earth. So I'm going to read you a small passage later from my book about child soldiers. It's not easy for me to live with these memories, but in a strange kind of way, I feel incredibly privileged to have them, and I feel very lucky to have them. Because every day it reminds me how lucky and fortunate I was to have been born in suburban America in the 1960s instead of in Baghdad or Grozny or Sarajevo or Mogadishu or Basra. And if anything, why I'm speaking to you tonight, and if you come away with one thing, it's that you have an awareness of what you have and other people don't, and the fact that your compassion and that awareness can be channeled into something to make a difference. A lot of people ask me how I started, so I'll bore you with the details of that. But I didn't set out to be a reporter at all. I wanted to write fiction, and I went to the Iowa Writers' Workshop nearby, and I became a journalist by chance because one day I picked up the Chicago Tribune and I saw a photograph of an Israeli soldier burying a Palestinian teenager alive with a dump truck. And I was so horrified. I had no idea I really wasn't very interested in politics before that. I lived in a kind of isolated academic world. And I read the article, and it mentioned the name of an Israeli lawyer called Felicia Langer, who was a Holocaust survivor and was at that point one of the only Jewish Israeli lawyers to defend Palestinians in military court. And it basically was a terrible job. She had been doing it since 1967. She had won 2 cases. She was constantly getting thrown out of court. And worse, she was a very emotional character, so she would burst into tears when she knew that justice really wasn't going to prevail. And I have no idea why, but when I read that article, my life changed completely. And I found her phone number. I found it by directory assistance, I think, and I called her, and I just lied and said I was a journalist, and could I come interview her? And she said, surprisingly, yes. I mean, just if you want to see what it's like here, you must come. So I borrowed the money, and I got an assignment somehow for a magazine that no longer exists, and I went, and I stayed there, I think 5 weeks that first time. I walked in when I first met her, and she was sitting at her desk crying with this huge file behind her, and she was basically working on the case of a Palestinian teenager who'd been beaten to death in Israeli prison. And she was trying to get the body exhumed to get evidence, and it was impossible. So she was sitting there weeping and weeping, and she said, okay, let's go. And we just got in her car, and she took me that minute, like, to the West Bank, and I went to my first refugee camp ever, Dahesha, which is near Bethlehem. And it was as though I had no idea this existed. I had no idea people lived like this. Of course, I'd seen pictures of suffering in Africa and the Ethiopian famine, but I had no concept of the kind of scale of injustice going on in the world. And I just knew I could never, ever, ever go back to my life before and be an academic and write fiction and try to get stories published in the New Yorker. It just wasn't going to happen. So she did a huge favor for me, which is basically she took me all over the West Bank and Gaza, and she passed me on to her contacts and her people and introduced me to a lot of the Israeli left. And when she left me, I basically stayed in the region for quite a while, and I wrote my first book, and then I got drawn into the Bosnian conflict. But I mean, the main point for me about working in Israel and Palestine, and I see from the news tonight there's a glimmer of hope with the Annapolis summit. I hope. I'm a bit cynical about it, but let's see. Is the effect of this long war and conflict on the future generations. At the start of the first Intifada, or uprising, in the late 80s, I began interviewing children in Gaza who were working with a psychiatrist because they had been traumatized in some way. And in those days, that was before the post-traumatic stress disorder was really a big buzzword. But these kids were very damaged. You know, they had witnessed either the death of a sibling or a parent. They were terrified of Israeli soldiers. They had lived with helicopter gunships. More importantly, Gaza is probably the most claustrophobic place on earth. And they lived in incredibly inhumane conditions in refugee camps. So I'd sit with these kids at their school and make them draw. And it was interesting because, you know, they weren't like most kids. They didn't draw dogs or houses or rock stars. They drew stuff straight out of Apocalypse Now. You know, they drew soldiers dragging their father off. They drew helicopter gunships. They drew people dead. They drew tanks. And their teacher told me about how traumatized they were, that they, you know, their sleep patterns, their eating patterns, they wet the bed, they had nightmares, they were anxious, they were twitchy, they just weren't having a childhood. So 15 years later, I went back to Gaza, and I was with the same photographer I'd worked with, and we had photographs of these kids. So we went and tried to find them, and I'm sure you can imagine what happened. Most of them were dead. The few we found a couple were in prison. Most were dead, a couple were in prison. The few we found, it was so sad because they had absolutely no hope. It was as though the hope that they might have had as children of what they could have become, what they could have grown into, was completely squeezed out of them. And their entire lives had been spent in a conflict zone. They knew nothing but guns and tanks and checkpoints and curfews and humiliation and deprivation. And it was a really depressing report for me to do because it illustrated, for me, the most important thing about how war passes from hand to hand, generationally, the sorrow and the misery. I remember being, after the war in Bosnia, meeting this incredible judge in Sanski Most, which is a town in northern Bosnia, which had really been razed very badly, and a lot of the Bosnian Muslims were taken away early in the war and taken to actual concentration camps. That's what the Red Cross called them. And I met this judge who was this incredibly, one of those people you meet in life who you just never forget because they're so courageous and so brave and so simple and so honest. And he was trying to track down the neighbors who had turned in, because a lot of neighbors turned on other neighbors and said, take them, take them. And he found the man, this judge had spent quite a bit of time in a camp and was beaten and brutally tortured. And he found the man who had turned him in to the police to take him away. And he said, and it turned out he knew this guy really well. They'd grown up together, they went to high school together. And he said to him, why did you do that? And the guy said to him, do you remember when I had to go before you in court and I had all those parking tickets and you impounded my car? Well, I never forgot that. And as the judge told me this story, I just thought, my God, that's a really extreme version. But the more I would talk to people, especially in the Balkans, about their hatreds and the cycle of violence, it was always about, well, my grandfather in World War II was killed by Bosnian Muslims, or was killed by Croats, or was killed by Serbs. And they would harbor this incredible viciousness that would then come out in a cycle of violence. So how do we end this? T.S. Eliot once wrote, "After such knowledge, what forgiveness?" How do we live knowing that these things exist? How do we continue our comfortable, cushioned lives in Minneapolis or St. Paul, or in my case, Paris, knowing that in some part of the world at this minute, someone is being tortured, someone's dying in a conflict, someone is being raped? A child is going to sleep hungry, abused, listening to gunfire. Families are being separated. And the answer is that we live with it because we don't forget it. I was very disturbed by the war in Sudan at first. Now it's been taken up by celebrities, and George Clooney goes there, so it's different than a place like the Congo, for instance, which is completely ignored. But I saw this little article which didn't even warrant getting on the front page, and it basically said 29 people were killed by the Janjaweed militia. And I stuck it on my computer because I kept thinking about those 29 people. They didn't even warrant an item on the evening news, but it was 29 people who had a birthday, who had families, who had been babies once, and they were completely ripped from the face of this earth. And I kept thinking, who is going to ensure that something of them remains? And who's going to fight to see that their killers are brought to justice? And the answer is that we do by not forgetting them, either in thoughts or in real action. And journalism, as sad a state it is in these days, and we can talk about that later, it's a very different profession now than when I started out 20 years ago. There's not the budgets to send reporters off for foreign news. There's the advent of blogs and internet. People don't buy newspapers anymore. People don't listen to the radio as much. We're all so busy that we just don't have the time to devote to it. But still, when it's at its best, when it's really pure, a colleague of mine described it as shining a light in the darkest places of the world, and that's where it can go. I began talking about Simon Wiesenthal, and I'm going to end it with a quote by him. He was often asked why he had become a searcher of Nazis. Instead of going back to his career as an architect before the war, he had been a really successful architect. And this is the answer he gave. It's all a quote. he says back to the man who asked him, "You are a religious man. You believe in God and life after death. Well, I also believe. But when we come to the other world and we meet millions of Jews who died in the camps, and they ask us, 'What have you done?' You might say, 'I became a jeweler.' And another person might say, 'Well, I smuggled coffee and American cigarettes.' And still another might say, 'I built houses.' But I will say, 'I did not forget you.'" So I'm going to read you a few short passages from my book. I had a lot of trouble choosing which places to read from. I wanted to read from Somalia because I know there's a big Somali population here. I wanted to read from Iraq because I know it's very relevant. I wanted to read from Chechnya. In the end, I'm going to start with Sierra Leone, just because I saw this thing on the news tonight. And Sierra Leone is so frequently mentioned that I thought I would read it. It's about in 2000, when Freetown was being overrun by the RUF, I came across this child soldier who was a girl, who was actually one of the choppers. She was one of the people that chopped off hands. And I have to say, there's been several times in my career where I've sat in front of people and I knew I was in the presence of true evil. One of them was when I sat high above Sarajevo in Pale, which was the city from which they launched the attack on Sarajevo, with this insane Bosnian Serb leader called Nikolaj Koljević, who was a brilliant professor of Shakespearean literature, but he was so filled with hatred that he's the one that commanded the destruction of the Sarajevo Library, which was this beautiful library full of Ottoman manuscripts. And he was the architect of the destruction of Sarajevo. After the war, he tried to kill himself. And in a purely Shakespearean moment, he missed and didn't die right away. It took him hours and in great pain to die. And this girl was another person I sat in front of, and the entire time I was talking to her, I just did not want to be there. She was called Sia. Sia says she was 11 when her elder sister was killed in front of her. She didn't have time to weep. She was abducted by an RUF rebel soldier, taken to his command, and made a bushwife. That is, a sex slave who is kept in a command post and raped repeatedly by soldiers. When they were bored, they sent her into villages to attack Nigerian Ecomog soldiers to find out information. So she'd walk to the village wearing her best dress, seduce the Nigerians, and then when they fell asleep, she'd kill them. Before long, the RUF realized that Sia was a great little operator. She did her job, she had sex with the Nigerians, she got them information, so the RUF made her a captain. And after that, they put her through an initiation rite, which included carrying out her killing by eating the victim's heart and liver. And then they cut her all over, this is very common with child soldiers, and injected them with drugs. When I met her, she was 18. She still had the scars. She was a bit embarrassed to talk about what she had done, but she did talk about it. So one of the main things she told me was that she was such a good killer and that she felt very little guilt about it. She said, "I learned how to kill at close range with a pistol. They gave me 2 pistols. I always saw the people's faces before I killed them. I checked if they were dead, and then I gave them another shot in the head if they weren't." She says she was stoned when she did this. She snorted brown cocaine, took red tablets and white tablets, which I believe to be amphetamines, and then injected them with medicine, which was cocaine or speed. She said it made me strong and made me want to go out all night and kill. She was so good at killing and cutting off limbs that she began to train the younger children, sometimes captured 5, 6, and 7-year-olds, how to kill. One little boy who was called Anthony, who was 11, told me, "Sita was such a good teacher. She told us to kill or she would kill us, so we killed." Now a little piece from Afghanistan, from Tora Bora. That's Tora Bora, in fact, during a rocket attack, and That's my very brave fixer, Ahmed, holding my sat phone. And I've still got my notebook in my hand, which I'm very proud of. Sometimes the bombs, I'm talking about here the American, I don't know if any of you remember the B-52 bombing of Tora Bora when it was believed that Osama bin Laden was hiding in the caves. But of course, he had escaped several weeks before that, and instead we bombed a lot of villagers. Sometimes the bombs miss, and then they hit the villages. Sometimes people are killed, and we don't hear about it, and it reminds me of a terrible journalist joke. If 1,000 people are killed in a rainforest in Brazil, but there's no reporters to witness it, did it really happen? In Jalalabad, the only hospital is a reeking, filthy place with dirty blankets and peeling walls. The emergency room is a stinking pit with cubicles separated by grimy sheets, and a mujahideen wounded fighting near Tora Bora, puking from pain while a crowd of children watch. There are 57 people here today wounded by an errant bomb. 15 have died this week. One of them, who is not yet dead but will be dead soon, is a little boy lying on his side. He's called patient number 10. He hasn't woke up since the B-52 dropped the bomb that fell on his house 5 days ago and killed his father, his 3 sisters, and 8 other members of his extended family living in the house. Patient number 10 is lying in a dirty bed with a rag on his head and a dirty syringe in his arm. His hands are curled like claws, his arms are wrapped in more bandages. Sometimes he turns over and moans in pain or calls out for his mother. The doctor watching him speaks some English to me. He tries to be helpful, but when he speaks to the boy, his tone is harsh, maybe because he knows patient number 10 is a goner. He's had surgery to remove the superficial bits of metal from his skull, but they can't get the bits lodged deep in his brain. I then go try to find the mother and to find out what happened, and she's in total shock. She's lost her eye, and she tells me basically that they were sitting down eating dinner and drinking their tea when suddenly this enormous explosion happens, and she runs outside, scoops up 2 of her children who survived, and sees that her entire village, the only place she's ever known in her life, she's never traveled outside the village, is totally destroyed. And then the really telling part for me is when I'm sitting beside her. She's totally illiterate, married when she was 14. And I ask her if she knows who Osama bin Laden is, and she says, I heard the name, does he live in the village? And then she has no idea where New York or Washington is, and she has no clue why these gigantic planes flew over her head and killed her husband, and her family. And the worst thing is that she's left a widow in Afghanistan, which is possibly the worst thing that could ever happen to you. So she just said to me, I just don't know what to do. I've lost my husband, my daughters, and a part of my body. That's just one case. I can either read Somalia or Chechnya. Somalia? Maybe? Okay. Early morning Mogadishu. The wet equatorial heat is rising from the chewed-up streets, and the gunmen are already working. Truckloads of militiamen hanging off the backs of pickup trucks cruise the neighborhoods of South Mogadishu. They chew khat, the bitter narcotic leaf imported from Kenya. They wave Kalashnikovs above their head. The American Marines used to call them skinnies, and it still makes the gunmen laugh because it makes them seem innocent and sweet, like a cappuccino at Starbucks, which they're not. They're young men, some of them boys. They wear dark Gucci-style sunglasses, bandanas around their head, and homeboy gear, low-slung jeans, T-shirts, flip-flops. Some of them are barely into their teens. Their weapons are bigger than them, but they know how to shoot and kill and ambush and raid. Figli di nessuno, someone scrawled on a shot-up wall near the former Italian Cultural Center. Nobody's children. With the lack of government, one of the generals tells me, the militias are uncontrolled. At least 3 people a day are killed, wounded, and unaccounted for. But who cares? This is Somalia, a totally forgotten war, a totally forgotten country. Still, this is what it looks like, smells like, sounds like. The pop of bullets is frequent. The smell of decay permeates through the haze of heat. The trash lies heaped up in a pile, smoldering. A few children and veiled women wade through it ankle deep, searching for something to eat. If you try to take away the trash, you get shot. My friend Abdi says someone from UNICEF tried it once, but they tried to shoot him. No one wants to get shot, and no one wants to work for UNICEF, or any UN organization for that matter. Somalia is too high risk. Aid organizations are generally staffed by locals who still get kidnapped and killed. Abdi, my fixer, is one of the nobody's children. He tells me a story. He's one of 17 kids. One day in 1995, he's casually walking down a street with his brother when he hears a bullet whiz by. He looks down, sees it's gone, and thinks, wow, lucky again. Then he notices his brother is no longer by his side. The brother, who's 17, takes a few steps, stumbles, and falls. Abdi tries to lift him, but the boy doesn't move. Abdi finally rolls him over. He sees the same bullet that went through Abdi's sleeve has gone right into his brother's heart. He tells me the story one night as a way to comfort me because I had just found out that a very close friend, another war correspondent, had killed himself. And I had been very upset all day, and then actually it was really touching because the militiamen, if you go to Mogadishu as a journalist, you have to hire these militiamen to protect you. And I had 2 truckloads of these guys, and when they saw that I was upset, they very sweetly gave me, one by one, lined up and patted my shoulder and gave me presents, which was like a cigarette, a lighter, a leaf. I mean, it was very, very touching. And then Abdi said to me something which I never forgot. He said, we are all on that train moving closer to death. It's just that in Somalia, it happens so much faster. I could read another one from Chechnya, or we could start with the questions. What do you think, Sarah? One more, okay. Chechnya, another. The places I really like to report about are places that are forgotten and where the press doesn't usually go. So I don't enjoy working in Iraq anymore for many reasons, and we can talk about that later. But places like Chechnya, like Somalia, like the Congo, like Liberia, are really badly ignored. The war in Chechnya was brutal. I think probably, I'm going to say, up there with Liberia for me, and Liberia was really horrible, and Bosnia. But it was, one of the reasons it was so incredibly dangerous was the Russians wouldn't let any journalists in unless they went in with the Russian forces. So of course, if you do that, you're not going to see what you want to see, which is human rights violations and what they're really doing. And as you probably know, they killed Anna Politskaya last year, the very, very brave Russian journalist who continued to defy them and go down to Chechnya and try to report the truth. And they said they'd get her, and they did get her. So I went to Grozny in January 2000, and I couldn't have timed it better as a journalist, but as a human being, it was absolutely terrifying because I was there a week and Grozny fell. And for a reporter, you never want to be inside a city when it falls because of the chaos, because of the retreating army, because of the Russian forces coming in who would kill anyone who was a witness to what happened. So I was in a small suburb outside of Grozny. There were no other journalists there, by the way, aside from myself, a German photographer, and a French reporter, and that was it. And there was no UN, and there was no aid organizations, and there was no Doctors Without Borders, and there was one doctor operating in a schoolhouse, wearing slippers, and with very, very limited medication, amputating, doing a lot of amputations. So this is a couple paragraphs I'll read you from this horrible night when Grozny fell, and we were waiting in this tiny little suburb for the Russian forces had surrounded us completely with tanks and helicopter gunships, and at dawn they were going to come in and clean the town. And because I was stuck there with 8,000 Chechen soldiers, I was in a really bad place. The Chechens retreated at dawn, walking along a railroad track, and they asked me to go with them, and I refused because I knew the Russians were going to take them out by the helicopters. And I did get out, miraculously, dressed up as a Chechen refugee, a very brave Chechen guy. The Chechen women dressed me up. They put me in a car. They gave me a baby. I don't know whose baby it was, but we drove through the front lines. We drove through the Russian tanks, and basically the Russian soldiers just waved us through. They thought we were refugees, so I got out, and I got my story out. But it might not have happened that way. So the main thing, of course, that happened to me was that, as always in these moments, I had my satellite phone, and the battery was low, and there was no electricity. And so I made a call to my editor, and he started babbling on the other end of the phone, be sure you get this, and be sure you do that, and be sure to include this. And and I could see the meter on my satellite phone just going tee, tee, tee. And he finally shut up, and I hung up the phone, and then something really horrible happened, which is that the house next to me got rocketed, and there were kids in it, and everyone was killed. And when the Chechens I was staying with saw that I had been on the phone, they started screaming at me because they thought that my satellite signal might have been picked up by the Russians. So it was horrible. They then had to hide me in several safe houses because they thought if the Chechen villagers found out that I might have been responsible for this rocket, they would kill me. But so that was another really awful moment. But it turned out when I did get back to London, I did a lot of research, and I spoke to a lot of technical people that said there was no way I would have had to have been on the phone for 20 minutes for them to lock on to me. So it relieved my guilt a little bit. But so here's a tiny bit about the Fall of Grozny. The darkened room is full of wounded Chechen fighters who retreated from Grozny last night over a minefield. There's the smell of blood, heavy and warm, puddles of it all over the floor, fresh amputees mumbling or screaming in pain. They were tricked. The story goes that a Chechen commander bribed a Russian commander with $10,000 to let his men escape Grozny unharmed. But the Russians gave them a route over a minefield. It's a terrible story because as soon as the fighters realized that they were walking on a minefield, it was too late to run back. So some of them, the braver ones, ran forward and said, "See you in paradise," and blew themselves up so that the others could walk on their bodies to get out of the minefields. So when they arrived in this suburb, Alcancala, it was almost biblical, the scene. I've never seen anything like it. And the photographer I was with was a young German photographer, and he took the pictures, and he ended up being a member of Magnum because of it. They're extraordinary photographs of the Chechens were dressed in their winter white gear to blend in with the snow, and they were covered in blood, and they were dragging the dead behind them. And they were, of course, angry and sad, and they were throwing their guns and crying. It's a really horrible thing to see an army in retreat. At the first aid center, the doctor operates by generator, which flicks on and off. There's dozens of amputations to be done without many painkillers or much anesthetic. When I walk by, I see the flickering light, I see more blood, and I can't stand it any longer to hear screaming. In a small room, the lone doctor's in bedroom slippers performing an amputation with minimal anesthetic. The patient lying on the wooden table squirms, but that's all. He just squirms. There's a woman screaming, wandering from room to room looking for her brother. "Where is he? Please tell me where he is." She finds him a short while later. He's dead and covered in a white sheet on a stretcher in the corridor. All the time, the bombardment continues. Diaya, a 26-year-old woman fighter, takes me into a room and tells me about the past few weeks. She said it's been a living hell. The Russians are dropping every kind of bomb imaginable, she said. Cluster bombs, deep penetrating bombs that wipe out basements, even chemical bombs. The only thing they aren't dropping is nuclear weapons. I leave the first aid shelter and walk to a women's shelter. It's a Muslim country, so they divide up the men and the women into two shelters. And one thing that always impresses me about these places is how unbelievably organized people are. And they were underground, and the women even had cribs set up for the babies, and paraffin heaters, and pickled vegetables. And I sat all night with this old woman who was amazing, who was very strong and philosophical, and was basically saying to me, if it's my time to go, it's my time to go. And I was thinking, well, it's not my time to go yet. And then in this shelter was when the the women said to me for the first time, "Well, the real problem is in the morning when the Russians enter the village and clean it." And I said, "What do you mean clean it?" And she said, "They throw grenades in the shelters and in the houses of the people. The fighters will be gone by then, but we have nowhere to go." So they were all kind of just accepting the fact that they were going to be wiped out. By late afternoon, as the light dims and the deep Caucasus cold sets in, I go back to the hospital. Chechnya is totally isolated. There's no foreign aid workers here, one doctor, no UN, and aside from me, a German photographer and a French reporter. No other journalists. The place could get blown off the map, and no one would know, and no one would care. The wounded soldiers in their agony call out Allah Akbar, God is great, to each other. But Yeva, a young lawyer, sits with me and says the war is not really about religion at all, it's about freedom. "Can't anybody help us?" she says. "Don't we warrant any mercy from the world?" That's it for now. Thank you. So anyone who would like to ask a question, I hope you do, so we can have some dialogue. I spent a great deal of time in Iraq in the time of Saddam and then leading up to the invasion and throughout the war. In the time of Saddam, it was incredibly difficult to work because we were issued with Ministry of Information minders who followed us around, totally paranoid. There were cameras everywhere. We were reported back on. I went back to Iraq several times after the invasion, but then, and this was something that happened, something wonderful that happened to me, I got married and had a baby who was born in 2004. And having had some very close calls, nearly being killed. I'd been kidnapped by Serb paramilitaries. I survived a mock execution. Two of my colleagues were murdered in Sierra Leone on the trip I was talking about, and my car was surrounded by insane, teenage, stoned soldiers. I felt that since I had a child, I wasn't going to put myself in that kind of situation anymore. So I only went back to Iraq twice after he was born, and I couldn't work. I'm not a reporter that can sit inside the Al Hamra Hotel and read the wires and write stories from it, and I can't send out my interpreters to go talk to people and bring me back the news and write it. I need to go sit on the floor and talk to people, and it's impossible to do that now. I don't like being embedded. I did it once. It's not my thing. You know, I have respect for people that can do it, but I just can't do it because I need, what I report about is human rights violations, and they're not going to let you do that. So it's just not reporting war the way I know it, and why I have great respect for the people doing it. I don't know about any of you, but I have yet to read something that kind of perks my interest the way the reporting from, if you compare it to, say, the copy coming out of Rwanda in 1994, or the Balkans, or even Afghanistan. It's just very difficult to work there. The other thing is that, my generation, I'm 46, and, we started in the 80s. That was a very different time. We had news organizations, foreign editors that would give you money. We didn't have satellite phones, and we had telex, and then it moved on to these big satellite phones, and now it's, technology is really advanced. And you would go out and you would basically, find a militia and march into the jungle with them and stay there for a few weeks and bring back a story. And now it's not like that. It's a lot riskier. There's war insurance that foreign editors don't want to send young reporters out. I spoke to a journalist here from the Monitor, and we talked for a long time about how coverage of foreign news is getting smaller and smaller because budgets are smaller. And really, it's left up to very young stringers who are in places like Kabul and Baghdad now, or Baghdad is local reporters. These very, very brave Iraqis who continue to work, and if they're, if they're found out, they're dead. because they're working for, American organizations, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune. So I hope that answers your question. I mean, I actually think the best coverage of Iraq is not the newspapers, but the think tanks, things like the Institute of War and Peace Reporting, because, that's local guys on the ground who are really going out and talking to people all over the country. They're not just with an American unit in Ramadi or something. So.
Hi. You mentioned the story from Somalia, I believe, where you learned a colleague had committed suicide, and perhaps it wasn't because of his or her work during war correspondence, but is there a high incidence, do you know, of suicide among journalists, and how did you survive post-traumatic stress disorder yourself, having witnessed many of these atrocities?
Post-traumatic stress disorder is it's nothing new. It was recorded from the earliest wars. I think the Trojan War. There's reports of post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's been getting a lot more attention, and I'm really glad because when I started out, and especially the war in Bosnia, there were a lot of reporters killed. It was a very brutal war because reporters were targeted. There was you'd come out of your door and you'd get shot at. But yet, you were supposed to be in this very macho field, so you weren't supposed to come back and complain about it. And of course, the main thing was that we were leaving. The people had to stay behind. We could get on a UN flight and leave Sarajevo or drive out of it at some point, but we were leaving behind this civilian population who was terrified. So I think a lot of people swallowed it. And then, about 7 years ago, a psychiatrist from the University of Toronto called Anthony Feinstein decided to do the first ever report on the effect of post-traumatic stress disorder on war correspondents. And he picked a group of us, of 40 of us, and he followed us for 3 years. And he did extended interviews. And if you read the report, it was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And if you read the report, it's just, it's like, some people had survived plane crashes where they were the only survivors. Like 10 of us had mock executions. Someone had been raped. Someone had been shot in the knee. These horrific stories. And the incidence of drinking and drugs and promiscuity and failed relationships and divorce was so unbelievably high. And interestingly enough, the women, because the women were much, the women reporters, there weren't that many of us, had much higher drinking. The women were more likely to become alcoholics. So I'm not making light of this because it's actually a really serious topic. And the end result, when he finally finished the study and he saw each of us individually, was that I didn't have it. And I said to him kind of like a bit ripped off, like, why don't I have it? And he said, well, it's genetic. It's like alcoholism. And also, you're a writer. So you could kind of purge the horror. And I would go back to my room and I would cry and I would write about it. And, I kind of could act on it. But the worst people, the people who were the worst off are the cameramen and the photographers. Because my husband is a cameraman. And he does have post-traumatic stress disorder, and I can tell you he really suffers from it. There's new treatments now, which they're using with a lot of the soldiers coming back from Iraq. But it's to do with the imagery that they take in, while they're filming or while they're doing stills, and they're unable to process what they're actually seeing, whereas a writer apparently can. My friend who killed himself had been a war correspondent for many years, and he saw too much. He really did, and he just couldn't live with it, and he killed himself. And he, thank God, is the only one of my friends I know who did that, but I did lose a lot of others, who were killed in conflicts. So it's a very high-risk field, not just physically, but emotionally. I hope, does that answer your question? Good.
Hi, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about working with translators or how you really get these stories. When you go
Working
into
with what? Templates?
translators and
translators.
and sort of who you have to get when you go into these countries.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because these people are the people that sustain us, and they're like that guy there. The first thing I do when I land somewhere is I find what's called a fixer. And, I'm a print journalist. A TV crew goes with a whole, when you see CNN, there's Anderson Cooper. He's not by himself in the field. He's with 5 producers, 3 sound men, 2 cameramen, God knows what, a whole army of people. So they will have found for him the best translator on the ground. But if I go by myself, or a radio reporter, or, if you go, you have to find someone to translate for you, unless you're lucky enough to speak Arabic or Chechen or Russian or Serbo-Croat or, Indonesian or whatever. Usually it's interesting. I've always been really lucky, because sometimes my fixers, their English isn't the best, but they're always these kind of extraordinary human beings, because of course they're willing to risk their lives to help you get the story. And sometimes there's an ethical decision to be made, because I always said I would never bring my fixers on a front line. I'd kind of leave them behind. They could set things up, and but if it actually came to, bringing them, especially in the Balkans, I never wanted them to go with me. And I told this story this morning on the National Public Radio, but it's a horrible story. During the war in Kosovo, I had a fixer who was a young girl, a young theater student, who was translating Albanian language for me. And we were together for about 6 weeks. And in the course of this, we were together on a front line which got bombed accidentally by NATO. And most of my unit was killed. And it was these young guys. It was really sad. And when that happened, she kind of cracked up a bit. And I thought, oh, God, I've got to get this girl out of here, because it's just not good. But she suddenly wanted to kind of, I said, you're staying here, and I've got to go see what's happening on the next, climb higher and higher to get to the next front lines. And she kept wanting to go, and she kept saying these really odd things, like, I want to go, I hear someone lost his hand in the woods, and I want to go look for the hand. I mean, she was going nuts. So I kind of sustained her a little bit, and then when we got out of there, we started working on a project on rape. And it was a very sensitive project, because with Muslim women, the worst thing in the world that can happen to you is being raped, and they don't admit it. And I needed to, whenever you write a story about rape, you need to really get it right. And so it means careful questioning, and that's very sensitive and delicate. So she did this brilliantly. She was another woman. We could sit with these women. She was very patient. But what happened after 6 weeks of this was, one night she had a total breakdown, and it turned out that she had been raped at the beginning of the war. So, with her, I felt this tremendous responsibility. And I think the hardest thing is that then when it's time for us to go home, what do? Do you just leave these people? You become the most important thing in their life, and you can't just kind of walk out on them. So I've always really tried to help my fixers, and a few of them I've gotten out. Some of them I got scholarships, journalism scholarships. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes in the case of her, it's really sad, because she had a total breakdown, and I really tried to help her a lot. And then at one point it was too much, because she had really had this total break from reality. But there's others that I'm still in touch with. I still help them. I still get them jobs, and they're the most important people to us. We really need them. But one point about the language, sometimes it's really hard if you're not sure they're telling the truth, if they're not putting a spin on it. And I've had a few Palestinian fixers who, my Arabic is terrible, but I've been in Gaza, and I know they didn't translate it accurately, and I just said, he didn't say that. he didn't, like, she'll translate it saying, he just said our glorious Hamas will rule the world. And I'm saying, no, he didn't say that. He didn't say that. So sometimes you've got to be really careful who you get. But they're very important. They're called fixers. Someone should write a novel about them.
Hi. So as a freelancer, how do you decide when you choose to go to a country? What do you do to start? How do you dive in and choose what story you're going for, and then just launch into it?
It depends what it is. If in the days, I'm not a news reporter anymore. I was for many years. I had two hats. I worked for the foreign desk of the Times of London, and I wrote magazine pieces, for Vanity Fair or the New Republic or the New York Times Magazine. So that was really hard because news stories, I'd have to be doing Grozny Falls, and that would be my thing. And then on the side, I'd be trying to document human rights abuse in one specific village. Now, I'm too old to do that, and you get really exhausted running around doing constant news. So I just do magazine pieces. And the way I determine a story is I go very small. I find, what for me is really important is to try to get people who don't have a voice and who I can give a voice to, and who can tell the story of the conflict and the war through their own story. Because really, for me, it's totally boring to read some analytical report about the Middle East which is one of the reasons I'm so frustrated with the coverage of Iraq. I don't really care about what General Petraeus says, and I don't really care about what, what's happening in a small field hospital in the middle of, I want to know what the people are doing and how they're living and how they're getting food, and, is the university open up again, and who's doing, how people are surviving. So, for instance, in Israel recently, I've worked in Israel for 20 years, so it's a country I really, it's an incredibly frustrating country to work in. It's a really difficult country to work in. But there's extraordinary stories, and one story I did, which was a very small story, but for me, it told the whole conflict. And it was about a suicide bomber who was a 17-year-old girl who grew up in a refugee camp outside of Bethlehem, from a big family, completely unpolitical her whole life, very, very good student, just driven by complete frustration and a sense of absolutely no future to strap on an explosive belt and go into a supermarket in a Jewish settlement not far away, maybe 7 miles down the road, and blow herself up, and in turn blew up another 17-year-old girl who was a young Jewish girl. And I found their two families, and they lived literally 5 minutes from each other. And they were both mothers suffering unbelievably because, what could be worse than losing your child? And both of them told me the stories of their daughters. The Jewish mother told me about how sweet her daughter was and how beautiful and how she wanted to be an actress and how she wanted to go to California. And it was just heartbreaking because this girl's life was cut off because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had gone, it was Shabbat, I think, and it was going to be Shabbat, and she had gone to get some apples at the last minute. And, she was dead. And then the Palestinian girl, to hear her mother talk about her and just tell me about how she was brought up and how she had never known anything but life inside a refugee camp. And, her family had passed on this kind of sense of deep hopelessness. So for me, it's a small story, two people, but through them, I was able to write a big piece that kind of could tell the story through their words of the situation on the ground. So that's how you do it. And sometimes the best way to do it is to go somewhere and not have a plan at all. In fact, I never really, unless I'm going very specifically, I'm going to Pakistan to try to see Benazir Bhutto if they'll ever give me a visa. But so that's very specific. I'll go and I'll see her, and then I'll go out and talk to people from all walks of life to get the feeling on the ground. But it's often best to go without any plan, and it kind of morphs into something that is your story.
Hi.
Hi.
You said earlier that the environment in journalism is changing nowadays. Newspapers, magazines, they don't have the budget to send out correspondents to go and dive into somewhere and
Yeah.
find a story and come back with a story. So what recommendations might you have for this new generation of reporters, people who want to go and give voice to human rights violations and show the world these things, when maybe there aren't as many opportunities to do that? You said that there's a lot more stringers, independent stringers.
Yeah.
So what advice might you have for a new
Well,
generation of journalists?
There's two things I'd say. The first is that you don't need a war, and you don't actually even need to leave America to do really good human rights reporting. I think there's some really, really important stories to be told here. In fact, I think if I had to think back of the stuff that's touched me the most in my work, in my career, one story, or actually two stories, were in America, and they were after 9/11. And one was in my mother's hometown, which is an area outside of New York City that got really devastated by 9/11 because so many of the people that lived there were in the Twin Towers. And it was a portrait of a community and how this community had been blown away by grief, but how it came back together. And then the other story I did, which really made me cry, was about a small mill town in Maine, a very poor community which had lost more guys in Iraq than anywhere else, I think outside of a town in Michigan. There was another town in Michigan. And it was just this tiny town that had lost so many people. And some of these guys were in their 50s. And so I just kind of spent a few weeks and I hung out and that was an American homegrown story. But yeah, those took budgets to do too, I suppose. But what I'm saying is first of all, there's stories here in Minneapolis. You've got a huge community of Somalis, of Sudanese, of Mexicans. You've got poverty here. You've got people living without health insurance, which to me is, whenever I come, I live in Europe. I've lived there for 24 years, and I haven't had health insurance, because I live in a country where I'm taken care of. I'm so ashamed to be American that people, if you're poor and you can't afford health insurance, you don't have it. And you could die if you don't have insurance. That to me is a great story. So, on one hand, there's stuff to be done here. There's great poverty in America. There's great injustice. We're living in a time when, there's immense suffering. And the second thing is, if you feel like you have the balls to do it, then go to one of these places and be a stringer. And what that involves is choosing some place that interests you. It might be Afghanistan, or it might be, I would not advise Iraq to anyone, just because I think it is a place where you really need to know what you're doing. But Lebanon, Syria, places in Africa, and you get a bit of experience as a young reporter working on a local paper. It's what I did. I worked on a small paper outside of Boston and learned how to report a story, and then I just went. And, I had a couple $100 in my pocket, and you learn by going. And there isn't a foreign editor in the world who's not going to take your stuff if you're on the ground. So that's another way of doing it, but that's quite a risky, and, you need to be really brave to do that. But that is, I know, the way that a lot of young people now are working. When I read the bylines from Pakistan or Kabul, it's not my generation anymore. None of them are going there. It's people in their 20s and early 30s who, are going out there and doing it. But I cannot stress enough the first point, which is that I think in America there are some really important stories to be done. And my heroine, Martha Gellhorn, her best stuff wasn't from the Spanish Civil War. It was her reporting of the Depression in the American South. She traveled all through the South and wrote about life in great poverty. And that, to me, is some of the best reportage, better than any war reporting. So there's ways of doing it. Also, another thing, just a practical thing, aid organizations like UNICEF, UNHCR, Oxfam will always take journalists on trips. You know, they have a budget for that. So if you want to go to Darfur or the Congo or places like that, you just do a bit of research on the web and find the aid organizations, Save the Children. They always have a budget to take reporters places. If you can try to get it placed in your local paper or your magazine or whatever it is you write for. So that's a really good, and then you don't need the expenses. They'll take you, you'll stay in their operational camp, and usually they've got great stories too. So, and the UN in particular has huge budgets for that. So UNICEF, UNHCR, the World Food Program, Save the Children, Oxfam, MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, always has very good stories. So you just need to kind of do a bit of research and find what interests you and then go for it.
You know, it seems like you've seen so much destruction, so much sadness and grief in your career. I'm curious, at the end of the day, how do you deal with it? And also, what keeps you going? What makes you get up in the morning?
What makes me get up in the morning now is my 3-year-old boy. but no, it's a good question. Do you know what really kept me going? Is the people who would write to me or... when I was in Sarajevo, there was a little girl who I met who was then 12 years old. And she was the bravest kid I'd ever met in my life because her house was on the front line and her parents were going insane. And I would go visit them and the mother would be screaming and pulling out her hair and the father would be wandering around talking to himself. And the girl would be sitting there like a little old lady, saying, the war is going to end, I'm going to get through this, I'm continuing my studies, I am going to survive. And it was the eeriest thing. Well, I'll make a really long story short, but this little girl kept a diary. And I and a friend brought the diary to a publisher in London, and that diary became something called Zlata's Diary, which maybe some of you read as kids in school, and it became an international bestseller, and she became the first Bosnian millionaire. But, I mean, that's an extreme story. But the fact is, she is now, she graduated from Oxford with a first. I saw her recently. She lives in Ireland, and she came up to me, and she said, she had tears in her eyes, and she said, I have to tell you something, that you saved my life, not because of the book, but because you would come by our house every day and just give me some kind of hope that there was a world beyond Sarajevo, that someone cared about us. So something like that always keeps me going, or the fact that someone will read a story that I wrote and they had no idea that there was such suffering in Sierra Leone, or AIDS in India, or something I've done that will touch someone or bring some kind of tiny bit of difference. I mean, I'm not arrogant enough to think that, I can change policies, but I think that if someone reads it and goes away, and as I said, just kind of feels like, you know what, we're all in this world together, and I'm going to turn to my fellow human being and be a better human being, and then little by little the world might be a better place. Then, if I can inspire people that tiny bit by writing about the darker side of humanity, then I've accomplished something. So, I think that having seen all that darkness, I always ultimately have hope, because of all the horrible, evil things I've seen, I've met the most unbelievably courageous people who are so inspiring, and it makes me believe that, that's the other half of the world. So that's what gets me out of bed.
Okay, sure. I've heard criticism, not of your pieces specifically, but of pieces that go to war zones and do stories. Do you think there's a line between human rights reporting and some kind of almost human suffering pornography, almost like, I'm trying to think of an example, but do you know what I mean? Like reporting human suffering because there's an audience that wants to see it, or some kind of...
Well, I mean, as I was reading some of this stuff, I was thinking, oh, this is a bit too gross. It's a bit too much information. But obviously, when I wrote it at the time, I felt like that much information needed to be told. I mean, the fact is that there's nothing very pleasant about war or massacre or ethnic cleansing or rape. It's really horrible. And I think, if anything, we're programmed to see these Hollywood films about war, like Black Hawk Down, or I haven't seen any of the new films about Iraq yet, but, and it looks very glamorous, and it looks very exciting, and there's always some really cool soldier, and there's always, Bruce Willis defending a village of Nigerians, and it's all such crap, because, in fact, war is just utter chaos, with no one knowing what to do, no one knowing where the shooting's coming from, someone dying in front of you, being unable to save them, people dying of hunger, not having water. So I guess if people write about it in a extreme way, I personally have never read anything that's been, I'm going to say, in bad taste, and I've read some pretty graphic stuff, and to me, that needs to be told. Or photography. There's a very good point to be made. For instance, the BBC, which to me is the best news organization in the world, had a really big dilemma, I think, during the war in, I think it was Rwanda. It came to a head of what images they could run. And they couldn't, in the end, run very specific ones of very graphic things. And if you notice, I mean, some photographs, we were looking through the web before, and there was some pictures of Serbian soldiers who had been decapitated. That's kind of, I don't like that, but I think there are some photographs and some images that need to be shown. I'm not saying on primetime TV so children could see them, but, I think that, people sometimes need to be shocked out of their comfort zone to realize what's going on. There was a front page story in the New York Times a couple weeks ago. I don't know if any of you saw it, but it was about the Congo, and it was about rape, these women who were really brutally raped with bayonets. And I had phone calls from about 5 of my friends who never read stuff like that. And they were all saying, my God, is this really going on? This is so horrible, and what can I do to stop it? And I was really, I thought, good for this reporter who wrote it. He shocked, out of their comfort zone, 5 of my friends who aren't journalists, who have nothing to do with journalism, into a kind of, reality of this is what happens. There's some really dark stuff going on in the world. But on the kind of titillation stuff and the soldier of fortune stuff, that I have nothing to do with. I'm talking about, the real thing.
Could you please comment on the recent unrest in Paris?
You mean the strikes or the riots of the immigration?
Immigration.
Oh, yeah, I can. I did a long project for National Geographic about that. France is a very funny country. In many ways, it's an extraordinary country. We have great healthcare, great education, free daycare centers, but it's really for white middle-class people. And when the urban planners planned the cities in France, they put the projects outside of the main cities. So, you have Paris, you have Marseille, you have Strasbourg, and then on the periphery, you have the North African immigrants, the West African immigrants. They're really shuffled off into the sidelines. If you walk down Boulevard Saint-Germain, which is the main, one of the main streets in Paris, you don't see any black faces. It's a very white city. You might see them in the 18th arrondissement, which is a certain, but it's very, unlike London or Berlin or other European cities, it's very compartmentalized. So what happened with the riots was suddenly, the immigrants, the young people who can't get jobs, can't get apartments. It's a very old system, Paris, France. If you get a job, you have a job for life. You can never get fired. But it means that there's no room for other people. There's no room for the young. There's no room for people who don't have connections. There's no room for black people. There's no room for North Africans. And suddenly they couldn't take it anymore. And they started rioting. And in my view, it didn't go far enough. You know, they burned a few cars, they got into the center of Paris, then they were clamped down by the police, and then it ended. And it didn't end the frustration. It didn't change anything. And if anything, you know, our new president, Sarkozy, is, in my view, great on many levels. You know, he's going to crack the unions, he's going to change a lot of things, but his immigration policies are very scary. And France has the highest percentage of Muslims in all of Europe. It's something we need to face. You know, we can't just shove them off into the, you know, into the suburbs. And suburbs in France are not like suburbs here. Suburbs is a bad word. It's, you know, a place with terrible schools and terrible conditions. And so France is a country to watch because it's really going to explode. I really believe that. From this idyllic, beautiful little a year in Provence to something very dirty, because it, you know, the center has to rise, I think.
Well, thank you, Janine, very
Thank
much.
you.
And thank you all for coming. There are books for sale out in the lobby, and Janine will sign them for you. So please grab one and meet us out there. Thanks.